second edition of Nooksack Valley Heritage Center, and we're going to be talking tonight about transportation. Jim Berg and I am Marv Fullner, and we're going to be sharing just what the early roads were like and what went on back then. And so, Jim, are you ready to go? Okay.
Well, actually, I'm going to start before roads. I'm going to start with trails because, and I'll pass this one around. I have several copies of it, so you can have it if you want to know. This was the travel corridor in Whatcom County up until the time the white man got here. As you can see, it crosses the river, and it was known as the crossing, and because it was the only place that crossed the river. And it was a little different in those days because the Indians left canoes on both sides of the crossing. So when you got there, you got in a canoe and went across in the canoe and left it on the other side. So that's the way the Indians ferried people across, by putting canoes on both sides of the stream. But then in 1874, William Hampton was homesteading here, and he decided to take over the ferry, which worked out fine until 78. In 78, high water, log did his canoe in, and they found him down in the upper log jam. So that was the end of William Hampton. Then Dave Harkness took it over, and he was there until he died, I think, 84. And then Annette Harkness took it over, and she ran it until the railroad bridge went in. So then there was another trail which was earlier. The white man went down when they discovered gold in the Thompson, and so Delacy built a trail. You got a better map of that. Oh, I guess that one was Delacy's trail. So he built a trail all the way up to into Canada anyway, to where it met the Delacy's trail, and then it hit the Brigade Trail, and then they went all the way up to the Thompson. However, by that time Douglas had decided that too many Americans were coming in, and he had already lost Washington territory because they used to have a fort down at Fort Vancouver, and so that was Hudson Bay territory north of the Columbia. And then there got to be too many Americans in Washington territory, and so then in 1826, they moved up to Fort Langley. And by 1858, there were more Americans in BC than there were Canadians, and he decided he didn't want the same thing, because we were talking about 54-40 or fight, you know, which is way up by Prince Rupert, and we thought we were going to get a lot more. We got the whole Lower Fraser.
So Canadian territory extended clear down to Vancouver, Washington?
Yeah.
Wow.
Washington Territory, what became known as Washington Territory, was all Hudson Bay country.
Wow.
And they had their fort down there. And then when they realized that the Americans were driving them out, they moved up to the Fraser. And then by 58, that's 26, so it'd be, what, 32 years, they realized there were more Americans in Canada, and they could do the same thing again.
That's amazing, eh?
So he made a unilateral agreement that they had to come through Victoria and get a license to go up into the Thompson, and that ended the trail because nobody walked up anymore because they had to stop in Victoria anyhow, so then they'd go up the river by boat and catch the Brigade Trail at Yale. So anyway, those were the first trails. The Indians used trails. When they built the Delacy Trail, they did something the Indians had never done, and that's cut the brush and down logs from the trail so you could walk on the trail the whole way, because the Indians just went around things. They didn't bother to take anything out. And if you've been around our woods, you've seen trails that just go off through. Most of them are game trails. Well, that's what the Indian trails were. They were just like a game trail. And then when Delacy came in, he had to widen it 6 feet wide, and then on the ground and 8 feet wide so that the pack animals would have rooms for their packs.
I was gonna say, it sounds like he was thinking ahead there.
So they could pack all the way up to the Thompson. And then we got fancy, and the white man start moving in, and the white man doesn't like to walk any more than he has to. And the Indians never thought about not walking, but the white man knew that there were other forms of transportation. So they started talking, they got some horses, and they would ride out from Bellingham or Whatcom, that was before Bellingham, on horses. They had a stable just south of the river and a stable in Bellingham. So you could rent a horse in Everson, ride to Bellingham and stable it there, and then when you want to come home, you go get a horse and bring it back to the stable. Bill Tice used to tell me it was on the Central Road. So he was, but nothing went across the river except people in those days. And then they, in 1890, in 1874, they started developing what we call roads. But I was going to show you a picture that I couldn't find the original, so I can't project it. So if you see this picture of Aunt Charlotte walking along a road, that's what the roads were. Basically 2 ruts through the woods. And so that's a road. And the first one was the Telegraph Road. You know why they call it the Telegraph Road?
The telegraph.
If there were telegraph was on it, that's right.
Hmm?
They were headed up with the telegraph.
Yeah.
They never finished it though.
No, they put the ocean one in and they didn't need it.
And Osterman was one of the first people at the crossing, and he was assigned out here in 1870. And so he had the telegraph, and of course his idea was to put his insulators on trees and stuff. So, and he had to ride the thing at least once a week to make sure that the engine didn't cut him down, or tree didn't fall on him, or something else, because that was the only communication they had between here and BC. They built one up along the coast, and then they built this other one inside, and that's where they got the Telegraph Road. By 1890, when the railroad came in, all the telegraph was along the railroad, so the Telegraph Road was no longer needed for telegraph posts. And the Indians and local settlers took all the insulators down and all the wire down and used it for other things. So, but the people out here realized that they'd have to get some produce and stuff out here. You know, this was wild country. There was no sugar, there was no flour. They could raise gardens, but they couldn't get the staples. So they had to have some way to get it out here, and that meant ferrying across the river. And Moultrie built a building in '75, and it became a store at the crossing. And then they started to complain. Marv has Road 75. How many of you have heard of the River Road?
The River Road? Yeah, the River Road. The one that goes along the river on the other side of the bank, right?
No, the one that goes along the river on this side.
On this side.
Went up to Deming.
Oh, River Road, yeah.
Well, this is how they requested it.
Okay, I have here copies of the original, what they call the River Road, or number 75. Basically, it's known more probably on the information that I have of number 75, and I will just read a little bit, kind of give you a gist of what's going on. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but first of all, to the Honorable Board, to the Commissioners of Whatcom County, the undersigned residents of Whatcom County respectively ask of the Board to make a legal road of the present road connecting the crossing with the forks of the Nooksack, commencing at or near the southeast corner of Everson's Orchard, and then south east along to the, well, okay, to the Indian schoolhouse, then following that wagon road. That's all they had. They had a road, but it was, most of the roads were wagon roads with ruts. And anyway, to the forks of the Nooksack. And then I'm going to go to another section, and I haven't told you the date yet, but I will. And also, this is signed by the ones that were, well, I recognize a lot of these names, are the ones that were
They were property owners,
property owners, and they
which
had,
means they were gonna pay the money.
they had to
pay
get
for
the
road.
okay. And so,
A lot of the people didn't have money, so they ended up working on the road in exchange for their share of the, getting it done.
well, anyway, this next copy is the land surveyor. And again, this is to the Board of County Commissioners, Whatcom County, Washington, and undersigned being appointed viewer. This is dated September 1885. And this is when they talked about it, and now they're going to do something about it. They have to survey it, again, southeast corner of Everson's Orchards and to southeasterly and so on to the forks of the Nooksack. And it goes on, and then it has, again, the people, and then it has survey marks and everything, which we don't understand. And
Surveyors understand them.
And it has more in here, but another thing, anyway, it got started, November 1885, and so they're on the way to build a road. And basically, it followed at times next to the river, but you didn't want to get too close. The river has changed a lot since then, which it does every year. And it went to Deming, like Jim said. And I do have another map here, Hollingsworth. You know where that was? You know where the casino is at Deming? It's right across there. Right across there on the hillside was where, and they had a little community there.
Called Hollingsworth?
Hollingsworth had a store and everything there.
Is that above where the library is now? The
Yes.
Deming Library?
Yes,
Okay.
it'd be right up there.
Has that been most of it?
They had to get where it didn't get underwater in winter time.
Well, yeah, they had to be up high there. Yes, that's correct. And there's just a minute. If I can find, just a second.
All the roads in Whatcom County are numbered, but they changed names. The original name was the first signer of the petition. That's where they got the name. And so they took the petition, and the first signer, that was the name of that road. But the number always changes, and so they've changed names of a lot of the roads, but the numbers have never changed.
Interesting.
So if you're looking for a road, you look for it by number, then you'll know which road you're talking about, because there's only one road by that number.
Okay, this is a general map, and this shows, you think of a road as being straight, the river's not straight, so it went accordingly. And what I want to show you next is here, this is Hollingsworth, and this proposed road, you know what that is? Mount Baker Highway. Wasn't even there yet. So this is road number 75. You see how it went? It just kind of went that way, and so this is a very good picture of, well, basically what Hollingsworth looked like, how close it came, and then it basically went from there, but they needed something, so they needed a good road so they could get where they're going, and they needed to get up to, well, Deming and beyond, because it was opening up, you know, mining and everything, Lone Jack in 1897. I got a lot of stuff on that. Well, anyway, and so they needed to do something.
Well, that was prior to Mount Baker Highway. Prior to Mount Baker Highway then.
Part of the Mount Baker Highway is
Yeah.
on the River Road, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It kind of crisscrossed,
It was closer, normally closer to the river and was not straight.
Okay.
Every time the river changed, they had to change the road. They wanted to stay close to the river, but they didn't, because there's no brush near close to the river. It's clear sailing. This is in my Glen Echo book, and you can have one of these there. It's the first 4 roads that were created on this side of the river. And how many of you know where Barnes Prairie is? Or Hog Prairie?
Oh, I've heard of Hog Ferry.
Yeah, well, you know, then you know where Barnes Prairie is.
I've heard for Hog Heaven.
Barnes was one of the gold miners that went up in '58, and when he didn't get as much as he thought he would get, he came back because he had noticed at Barnes Prairie on the way up. So he came back and homesteaded on Barnes Prairie, and he raised pigs, but he didn't keep them penned. So it became known as Hog's Prairie because there's all kinds of hogs all over the prairie. And that's where Clearbrook is now. So the Clearbrook Road would be, is going east from there. But the Barnes Prairie Road goes up what we now call the West Trap Line. And then it went across to the Van Buren, and then up the Van Buren to Barnes Prairie. So that the road is pretty much, Barnes Prairie Road is pretty much the trap line and the Van Buren. Went across it, they changed from the trap line to the Van Buren at Hampton. It went north till Hampton, and then it swung over, because there was a slough in there, still is, and it swung across south of the slough and picked it up and became the Van Buren Road. Well, there's a little town of Van Buren there, that's why they called it Van Buren Road. Because Van Buren lived there and he homesteaded there, and he had a store there and such. Now the Telegraph Road, of course, followed the old telegraph line up to Canada. So that one, and the River Road you heard about, they wanted to get down south. There was absolutely no way except on the river to get south from Everson. And so they created the River Road, and it went all the way down to the Forks, where the Middle Fork comes into the river. And that's, people used that up that far, like when they went to climb the Mount Baker and things like that. And then from there on, it was on foot through the woods. There was no road beyond that. And then, not Harkness, old-time family, decided they needed an interior road. If you can't see it on there, but there were a lot of homesteaders like the Bergs and the Pritzes, them, who were far away. We were over half a mile from the River Road, and we were a quarter of a mile from the Telegraph Road, and our houses were actually further than that. And so they developed this thing called the Goodwin Road, and it went basically down the Alm and then down the Gillies Road, and then came across the field. And that picture you saw in that book was the Goodwin Road as it was originally, because by that time they had developed some other roads, and so that was good. It went across my grandpa's place, and they just kept using it, but it wasn't. They'd actually put gravel on some of the other roads by then. So, and it, as you can see, it went up to the Goodwin, went kind of meandered through the fields until it got up to where the Goodwin Road is now. They went down to the Hopewell Road, and then it went from the Hopewell down on the Hopewell Road all the way to the River Road, which is west of the Highway 9.
How'd they manage to keep it so straight in this quadrant here, in this lower right quadrant? The lower right quadrant is so straight. It's like everything else is all, but this is, how'd they manage that one?
Well, that was Goodwin, and he's the one that made that straighten it. See, it's got a little curve in it, and that curve's still there. I think they said there were stumps there, and rather than blow the stumps out, they went around the stumps, and that's the reason there's a curve right there,
There you go.
which makes sense.
But it's super straight compared to the other ones.
So, anyhow, those are the first roads, and while they were anything but a modern road, we would never call what these were roads. We would call these rutted pasture roads or something. But that was, they could get around with their horses and wagons. The horses could pull over a hard rut, and they just pull it around until they got there.
So they were just dirt roads?
Hmm?
Dirt roads through, like...
Dirt roads. They didn't have any paving at all. The Telegraph Road had some puncheon roads, had some logs laid across the roads to get them across the bogs. There were bogs that could disappear in this winter, so they put logs diagonally across the road, and you drove on that. I would assume would be pretty rough riding.
Yeah, I guess.
Bump, 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 bump over the puncheon road.
Wasn't the pole road like a puncheon road too?
Hmm?
Wasn't the pole road a puncheon road too? Once the
There
pole-
were some sections of the pole, yeah,
Yeah.
that were puncheon road. But they weren't all puncheon. They only through the soft spots.
Jim, on this map here, was Tuxedo already a town?
Tuxedo was never a town. Tuxedo was a post office in my grandpa's house.
So was
My great-grandpa's house.
was that road there, was that on part of this map
Mhm.
prior to South Pass Road?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
The original South Pass Road went off, let's see. You see where it gets north of the Breckenridge Road there?
Yeah,
Then it went straight east. The road is still there, it's 160, but that isn't where the South Pass Road is now. One of the reasons people knew where the South Pass Road originally was, 160, is because they had a couple of, or at least one guy up on the North Pass who had a little problem with alcohol, and so when he came home, he always took the way he knew, which was through the woods on 160, because they built this new road across the creek, and he didn't know where that was, so he went the old way. So they knew that the road was there, and of course, it is. This, in 1890, they put a railroad bridge across, and that's when Everson became in existence, because the railroad put a big sign on the terminal that says Everson, because it was on Everson's homestead. And up till that time, nobody had ever thought of naming anything Everson. And so that was the start of it. Now this is before they developed the Telegraph Road. It says that this petitioner, which is Moultrie and Walker, asking to have the part of the road now north as a public legalized highway, beginning at the county road at the head of Moultrie and Walker's Lane. That was in what we called the village of Nooksack, which is where the Stickney Island bends and goes north after you leave the Hampton Road. And then it says, then running south through Harkness Lane to Nooksack River Bank, then west to the North Ferry Landing, and then across the river and Riverbank to other county road, which was on Mrs. Eddy's place. The Telegraph Road went from Mrs. Eddy's place on the south side of the river to Roder's place in Bellingham.
Oh.
Roder's place is where the Roder mansion was on Elm Street. That was the other end of the Telegraph Road.
Whoa. That's a
And So now they want to connect that road across the river to the roads on the other side. And so they're petitioning. And he said that this was in '82. But they said that one of the reasons is, that's another road. They wanted to make sure that this would stay as a road, because they might not, they could not improve it. The county could not improve it, and then it wouldn't be a road. But then there was another one here. The ferry crossing, Hampton, of course, died. Harkness died, and that was still running the ferry when the bridge was built in 1890 for the railroad track. But they didn't like people driving their cars, didn't have cars in, driving their wagons across, because they put boards down the middle of the tracks and for the horses to walk on, and drive their wagons across this railroad bridge to get across the river and save the cost of ferrying, and they could bring big loads across instead of small loads, and so the railroad didn't like that. So they were trying to get them to be, and so now they petitioned it, saying that there was another ferry run by McCaskill, and he was going to quit because there wasn't much traffic left, because everybody was using the bridge. So they said, you either got to put in a bridge or another ferry. And so they, this is the petition for that. And that was also Moultrie. Residents of Nooksack and the vicinity are, as previously, subjected to a great inconvenience through the stoppage of the ferry boat on the river at Nooksack Crossing. Mr. McCaskill, who has run the ferry boat for several years past, has seen fit to stop running the ferry. So now there's no way across the river except to use the railroad bridge. And so they got busy and started to work on the highway bridge, which we knew went next door.
Well, was that railroad bridge, was that the metal one that was there when I first moved here? Was that the one that was built back then?
The one that burned is the one that was original.
The one that, so it, yeah, okay, wow, that was the original one.
Yeah, it
Wow.
lasted over 100 years.
Yeah.
And it was, and then they built the highway bridge, which didn't last near that long.
Right.
So,
Wow.
but anyhow, those are the way the roads got in. And that's kind of the way developed. And then I have another map here. By 1893, you can see, I got some people in here, but you can see they started to develop more roads. And you notice the river road is kind of not being used anymore, because now Carlson has put a road in and goes down where the state highway goes. Moved it over and then went straight south along the railroad tracks, along the east side of the railroad tracks. And so now they're using that road instead of the river road, which is paved in this area. When I was a kid, we used to call that the pavement.
Yeah, the Lawrence Pavement, you mean?
The Lawrence Pavement.
Yeah, Lawrence Pavement Road, that's.
It was the only concrete road. There was another one, the Pacific Highway, which went down through Ferndale and Haney, and that was built in 21.
Okay.
And I'm not sure when Highway 9 was paved.
Highway 9 was paved in 1919. 1919 at $213,000.
That's what Chuckanut was paved that year too. And Everson was paved in 1921.
Yeah.
So they started to use concrete by that time, and some gravel. Most of the roads on our side came out of the gravel pit on the Berg property. They just what they did is each person would gravel his portion, and then they'd talk the county into coming out with a road grader once or twice a year and leveling it off. Because if those of us who have lived around here know that within about 2-3 weeks, we only have washboard roads. You don't dare go more than 35 miles an hour, you shake the car apart. And so we didn't have to have speed limits on those roads because they were natural.
Well, they had the what was it, the Donahue Road Act, that adjoining property owners had to pay for the pavement. Because I know guys that lived on the pole road said they had to pay for it. And then west of Linden, some of those people lost their places for taxes because they couldn't pay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, and they may not have been ones that were wanted the road.
No. Well, it didn't last that long either. They found out people couldn't pay that kind of money.
Yeah. Well, that's why I say a lot of them put in grunt labor
Yeah.
as opposed to paying taxes. And all of the earlier projects that took place around the end of the 18th and start of the 19th century, or 20th century, end of the 19th and start of the 20th, it was all hand labor. And they just, everybody got in and built their roads or built whatever they were going to build, and they lived with it. None of this people in Bellingham or Whatcom expecting to do anything because they knew they didn't even know they existed out here.
I run across some tools once, and they rotted that concrete down. It was 6x6 on each side, and then they had a 6x6 with 2 plow handles on each end and a big suite on each end. And that's how they made the roads.
Oh,
That would be hard work.
yeah. that's
Yeah, I
right.
remember driving on those roads for a minute. They are 8 feet wide on both
Yeah.
sides.
Yeah.
And now our freeway lanes are 12 feet wide.
Yeah. Yeah, the first
And,
what they paved on the guide town was only 6-foot lanes.
Yeah. And there were no shoulders. I remember when we were teaching kids to drive, we taught them how to get it off the road and back on the road. Because they were going to eventually run off the road. And then most of them went in a ditch if they didn't know how to parallel the road and then bring it back on. If they tried to force it back on, they usually went out of control.
Or upside down, one or the other.
Oh, wow, that's crazy. So in order to have a road, you had to make a petition for one. But then after your petition was accepted, you had to pay for your portion of the road
Right.
or work for your portion of the road.
All the county agreed to do is make it a legal road,
Okay.
basically.
So that's why you were petitioning, so the road would be recognized as a legal road and recorded as a road.
Right.
Okay.
And
Huh.
once it became a legal road, then it stayed a legal road. Some of them are abandoned, some of them never did really get built.
Well, what if like, you know, that where you want your road, only 6 out of maybe 13 people want that road there, is it still gonna go in? Or do they put a road in when you make a petition regardless, or do you have to have a consensus of the people that live in that area for the road to go?
If there were enough people who signed the petition, they granted the road petition. But like the Old Coal Road was, the first part of the Old Coal Road was petitioned by my grandfather, and it was a 1/4 mile long. It ran down to where my wife's property is. And then years later, they extended it on down to the Massey Road. Well, the Massey Road had originally been my 2 uncles' driveway.
Oh.
And so then they wanted to extend it on south to what is now the Mac Road. And Oat Cole lived on that road, and he was a fisherman. So all winter, he worked on that road, and he built that road all the way from the Massey Road to the Mac Road by himself.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's why it's called the Oat Cole Road.
Yeah, I guess so. I was
Otis
naming it
Coles
after
is
myself.
his name, but I think he took 4 or 5 years. But you know, there were stumps in the way. He had to pull the stumps, blow the stumps.
Goodness
But
gracious.
he did spend all winter. And so that was a road built, there was 1 mile of road built by one man. I'm sure there were some of the neighbors pitched in once in a while. But most of them were too busy farming. They didn't have time to work on roads, and he was a fisherman, so he had the time.
Right. Wow,
So,
interesting.
well, that's the basic transportation, early transportation here. And so I think and then if you can see, here's a 1902 map. You can see all the roads that have been added by '02, and then I have a 12 map which shows a whole bunch of more roads. There were a lot more people here then, and as soon as people moved in, they wanted a road to serve their property. And of course, they had to dedicate the right-of-way. Not only did they have to build the road, but they had to give the land up for the road too.
Right, right, right.
Not like it is today where you buy the land and build the road for them.
Well, wasn't there some of the roads until the law changed that was automatically a 60-foot right-of-way? This Everson is like that. It was
The what, excuse me?
60-foot right-of-way.
Right.
Automatically if it was a certain road before a certain time, but don't ask me the time.
Well, because the county and I have a disagreement on the Massey Road as it goes by my place out there, because we
Yeah.
dedicated 20 feet on either side of the center line.
Yeah,
That is not a 60-foot right-of-way.
well, it just
But the
depends.
county assumes it's a 60-foot right-of-way.
Depends when the road was built too. That law only lasted a little while.
Yeah. So, but, you know, there's some 80-foot rights-of-way in this town, or in the county. And Bellingham had some 100-foot rights-of-way. And Railroad was a 100-foot right-of-way.
Yeah.
So, there were bigger rights-of-way, but 60 was kind of the standard. So the railroad was interesting. Whenever they were going to put a new road from, say, Minneapolis to the West Coast, they were given a 150-mile wide right-of-way to work within. And then when they got the railroad built, when they got the line built, they were supposed to pull it back to 150 feet. And now it's 50 feet. So, but a lot of the railroads sold off their land before it was taken away from them.
Didn't they get a section of land and then skip a section? They inherited a lot of land between here and there.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who lost their land because they didn't get it proved up on.
Yeah.
They just weren't. And of course, I think there might have been some politics in some of that.
No.
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Bernard Dieter used to tell me about his uncles who proved up on their place, but Westergreen didn't think they had proved up enough, and so they lost their place.
Yeah. Depends who got to the courthouse first.
So the grid work of that map you just passed out, is that people's parcels?
The what?
It's all in a grid work. Is that the parcels of land, people's parcels, or what's the grid of that? It's in a square grid?
Normally, the county had put a road on every section line and every township line.
So those are individual sections, those
Correct.
squares are?
They're a
Oh,
mile apart,
okay.
and that's the grid system that pretty well covers the county. Not all roads are. There are some roads that meander.
So
like the-
you
like
could,
the-
you could purchase a section?
Well,
What?
the
How did that
the
work?
home ownership was based upon the survey that was township and range. And so the edges of the property were all on the section lines or the township lines.
Oh, okay.
So they could make a road along the edge of their property.
Oh, I see, okay.
They had some awful curves where they met too. Like getting the Sumas and that, them curves.
Oh,
A lot of Model Ts got tipped over on them.
I bet. I've almost put those in.
Yeah, then they started getting cars,
Yeah.
and cars didn't do too well on these roads that they had.
You can drink too much beer and the horse will take you home, but the car
That's right. The horse always go back to his.
That's very true.
yeah.
You relied on the horse to carry the sleigh through the deep and driving snow, huh?
Something like that.
So with the horses and the wagons, folks needed to get to Whatcom, right?
What?
People needed to get to Bellingham and Whatcom to get supplies and,
They needed to get to a nearby trading post.
okay.
The trading post brought it out from Whatcom, which was Moultrie's trading post in the village of Nooksack before the buildings in Everson were built.
Where was his trading post?
So there were always entrepreneurs who brought out the stuff from Whatcom, and they had big wagons, but and if you were like my family, were in Whatcom and you were going to go out to the crossing, if you were a pregnant woman or a very small child, you got to ride on the load. Otherwise, you walk behind the load.
Wow.
All 17 miles.
And how long would that trip take?
Hmm?
How many hours would that take, this
Oh, it didn't take that long, 4 or 5 hours.
4 or 5 hours?
Yeah. I always remember Hawley saying in his book that one New Year's Day, must have been around New Year's Day anyhow, he walked from Linden to the crossing, which is about 8 miles. Then he walked into Bellingham, or into Whatcom, and paid his taxes. And then he stayed all night with Victor Roeder, and then walked back the next day in 4 inches of snow. I don't think very many of us would be that anxious about paying our taxes. Those are some of the great stories that I want to make sure that are captured, because my generation is dying off, and most of my parents' generation is gone. So if these stories aren't written down someplace or recorded through a video or something, the stories are gone, and they'll never know what it was like here.
Yeah, that's what
It wasn't easy living here in the old days.
There's a lot of young people at the cemetery if you look around.
Huh?
A lot of young people at the cemetery if you look around.
Yep.
They, for any kind of reason, too hard to work or sick, pretty much.
There's one gal up there that just says by fire, and she's like 16 years old, so I wonder what happened. You know? It's like, just says by fire.
My grandpa tells a story. He was a sexton. My great-grandfather opened the cemetery, and he was a sexton. In those days, it was just a clearing in the middle of trees, tall trees, all around. And he was up there about dusk and finishing off a grave, and somebody said, "Who died?" He said he just felt like laying down in the bottom and say, "Me." He said he was,
So scared.
he didn't think there was anybody within miles, but somebody had seen him digging a grave and went over to find out who had died. And so I do, and then my uncles also were grave diggers too, great uncles. So, but great-grandpa only lasted 4 years. He started their cemetery in '86 and was buried there in 1890. So the kids took over the cemetery then for a while. So, but that's, you know, whenever you're in the middle of a wild wood and you just think you're all alone, and then somebody says, "Who died?" He said, I never had any trouble figuring out what he was saying.
Jim, can I ask you a quick question about the you said there was a trading post in Nooksack Village. Was that where the mercantile is now? Is that?
No, that's south of the Stickney Island at the curve. The road
Oh,
coming
so
up,
that was in Everson actually, even though,
west of Everson.
yeah.
The village of Nooksack was west of Everson. About a
Oh, okay,
mile.
so you weren't talking about the city of Nooksack, you were talking about something different.
I was talking about the village of Nooksack,
Okay, that's different.
which is different from the...
Oh, okay.
The village of
Interesting.
Nooksack was the first platted town in this area, and
Oh,
it was west of Everson.
oh, funny.
And there was a
interesting.
drugstore there, and there was a church there, and a school, and a trading post, and a ferry.
Why did it end up on the other side?
Hmm?
Why did Nooksack end up over there then?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. Well, I guess Everson was thought of. No, Nooksack was platted first. So,
That's funny.
well, the reason Nooksack was platted in that location
Uh-huh.
is the railroad.
Well, yeah, I know that, but
The
I just
railroad
wondered.
was going through there, and they were going to put a station in Nooksack, and it was one of those debarking stations where you came north out of Seattle, and when you got to Nooksack, you got off the train and stayed overnight in the hotel. Well, the railroad bought Hauser's whole homestead and then platted it. So the railroad owned the whole plat.
It's like a railroad.
And then they started developing. But the first building was the big hotel. And then it burned down in '6, so that didn't last too long.
Right.
But by that time, they didn't need, they still had them on the Canadian Pacific, but they didn't have them in the U.S. lines anymore.
Jim, do you think it's possible that that crossing was called the Nooksack Crossing, and so it took the town name of Nooksack?
The whole valley was called the Nooksack,
Okay.
because the Nooksack River ran through it and the Nooksack Indians occupied it. So the whole area was called the Nooksack.
Okay.
And so when Moultrie platted that area, the natural name would have been Village of Nooksack.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the very first plats in the county. Do you know where Wesley is? Wesley was platted about the same time on Stickney Island, or next to Stickney Island, where Linden is now. It was down on the flat, and the river eventually took it out. So, but it never developed much. The Village of Nooksack did have, about over half of their lots were developed, and they're still, I know one of the guys that lives over there, Ruda or somebody, Dutchman, and he said that he found the original cable from the ferry down in these woods towards the river from where he is. So he knows, I know exactly where the road was. It came up from the river, and he knows it. And of course they moved the school, and but one of the interesting things I thought in my book I was reading, if you passed the 8th grade test, they said so in the paper. Everson didn't have anybody passing the 8th grade test that year. Nooksack had 6. And nobody else had more than 2. Most of them only had 1. And the only thing we can figure out is there either was no 8th graders in the Everson school, or their 8th graders didn't make it, which is very possible. If you read those 8th grade test scores, you'll understand why. My mom didn't tell me until she was probably in her 70s. I said, you said you had a nervous breakdown your senior year. She said, I did. And I said, well, how'd you graduate? She said, I didn't. And I said, well, you claim to be a graduate of Nooksack and you go to all the alumni things and everything else. Well, it turns out that she did have a nervous breakdown, but she rose from her deathbed and played the senior romantic role in the senior play. Then she went back to her deathbed for a while until the bank opened. And when the bank opened, she became their first teller. And a year later, the principal said, anybody that can hold a bank job for a year deserves a diploma.
Oh,
So she got her diploma.
honorary degree.
But then I found out she'd spent 2 years in the 8th grade. She didn't pass the geometry section of the thing. She had to wait till her brother had taken the test and then could tell her how to do geometry. So he started a year behind her, but he ended up graduating a year ahead of her.
That's great. That's
Any other questions?
Any good travel stories of the wagons down there? I remember reading, I think it was in your book, about that it almost took a day to get a wagon down to Bellingham and back, and
Yeah, the wagons were much slower.
Yeah.
You could walk faster than the wagon, because often there's a big dip at the Deer Creek, I think it is, south of Laurel. And often the horses would go down, but they wouldn't pull it back up the hill. They had to unload it. And then the horses would pull the wagon back up top of the hill, then they had to load it again, because the horses were controlling the operation. You couldn't just whip them and get them to go up the hill, they just wouldn't go.
so what did you do if you busted a wagon wheel halfway through?
Hmm?
What would you do if you busted a wagon wheel halfway through?
Well,
walked
then you had
down?
to stop and put a new wagon wheel on and all the rest.
You had to find a guy who knew how to make wheels, that's what you did.
Yeah, there were.
Is that what a farrier did? A blacksmith? They made wagon wheels,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well, you
did-
think
they
about
did
the people
shoes.
crossing the prairies. They had to stop and make their wheels.
Yeah. Had to find the wood too at that
And
part
had to
of
find the
road.
wood and make the wheels.
Crazy.
And sometimes they just
Take a
left the
spare
wagon
tire.
there and put everything else in somebody else's wagon. And then took the extra wheels off of it so they'd have spares down the road.
Yeah, that's what
They're steam bent, aren't they? They're not whole pieces of wood, aren't they steam?
No,
Nothing steam bent, you fit it,
they're all fitted.
and they put a hot tire on.
And you don't have woodworking tools out there on the trail. You have hand tools, but you don't have power tools of any kind.
You thought changing the tires.
We even drill holes by hand.
It's here.
Wow.
Drilling holes always reminds me of the Everson Water Department,
Yeah.
because the Everson Water Department caught fire.
Oh, great.
And so they thought they'd just drill holes in the bottom of the tank, and the water from the tank would come down and put out the fire. The only thing they didn't realize is they had 2 feet of sand in the bottom of the tank. And so the water didn't come out,
Oh,
and
no.
the thing burned down, never to be rebuilt.
Oh, that's terrible.
Life's full of problems.
So how did the railroad coming in, how did that change industry development?
what?
The railroad, was there a big increase in growth when the railroad came in?
Oh, yes, yes. Up until the time of the railroad, they had no way to get produce out or produce in, except horses and buggies, doing the wagons pulling things around. But when the railroad went in, then they had all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, but there was a great big, the book I helped Neil finish, said he has documentation of 15 railroads that intended to terminate in Bellingham Bay. And 4 of them made it. But here in Everson, the big thing was the Canadian Pacific would bring passengers from the East Coast and then come down to Bellingham and unload them. And they'd have to come down to Sumas on the Canadian Pacific, and then they'd change cars and come down the rest on the Bellingham Bay and British Columbia Railroad. So that was the big deal in 12, whenever they connect, no, it wasn't, it must have been 91,
By
when
the
they
way,
connected.
can I interrupt? This is a ribbon that commemorated when the railroad met together. And it's dated November 27th to 28th of 1891.
The way it's remembered is whenever the Canadian Pacific came in with all of their wonderful passengers and dignitaries and everything, the fire departments, the Seahone, and there had an arch, a water arch over the train as it came in, and then they decided to have a water fight. So we remember those, but that changed when the railroad came in, then everything changed.
Yeah.
Roads weren't nearly as important then, because everything, Mom used to say when she went to Bellingham, she would walk to the railroad at Everson, which is about 2 miles, and get there for the 9 o'clock into town, and they would get down, it was only a couple hours, it wasn't even that, I don't remember. But anyhow, they'd go down to Whatcom, and then she'd catch another train or trolley out to Silver Beach. And then she'd walk from Silver Beach out to Aunt Mary's up on Hillsdale, which is another couple miles, and she'd get there about 4 o'clock. So she started out from home at 8 in the morning, and she got to and now it's a half hour. In those days, it was much longer. Then they'd stay overnight for a couple of days, and then they'd head back.
Wow.
So,
I know we're going to take a real short break. I know Christel's going to ask about the immigrant train when we come back, and so we'll take just a real quick brief break and switch out the tape. We'll be right back.
I'm going to be talking about the little, it wasn't a town, but a licking, which was located near Lawrence, which was in Township 39. And I don't know how many of you know anything about it. Do you know where it is? Where it used to be?
Lawrence,
Yeah, it's on,
Highway 9,
it's right kind of by, is it kind of by the Lutheran church there? No, it's not quite up that far. It's in that one bend in the road, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Licking was before Lawrence, and J.V. Smith was the first homesteader there in the middle 70s, and Licking, the only thing that had it Licking was the post office and the store. And then there was, around it was shingle mills and so on, but it never was a town, okay? And how Licking got its name is Mr. Smith came from Licking County, Ohio, and he thought that it should be named Licking.
It's a strange.
And that's how it became. And roughly that was in 1885 in that area. And where Licking was, I have a map here, but where Licking was, you leave Everson on Lawrence Pavement or Highway 9, you go down to the railroad tracks, if you know where the George Road is. That is where Licking was, on the east side, if you know where the Ray Syrie place was, or is and still is. I know that you don't live around here, some of you, but that's where it was. And also they had a school, a log school. If you know Bill Hagemeyer, it was on his place. That's where their first school was. And the one that owned before him was an Ole, his first name was Ole and his last name was Hagen. And I think that's who Bill Hagemeyer bought it from. But anyway, the school was there. And first of all, what I'm going to show you is how big Licking was. This is, I'll show this. This is the map that I just made. And actually what this is the Lawrence Township, and here's Lawrence, and these are all the original homesteads. And I made this my little cutie thing here. Let me stand up. This is, right now, this is 36 square miles. Let me outline this real quick. Okay, Everson is right here. This is the Massey Road. This goes, actually, believe this or not, clear up to the Mitchell Road. Right here would be Mount Baker High School. This is the Kelly Road. This, and of course, the Mission Road. That's how big it is. This is Lawrence right here. Licking is right there. And I made all these roads, and they are, and of course, the railroad, and so on. And I'll put this little thing I made in here, if I can do it correctly, it will work. And this was how big Licking was in the late 1800s compared to now. And so I had to make something that would show, so this added to my map. And so that is basically where the Licking Township was.
Why did it fade away?
It faded away because, for one thing, there was Lawrence kind of became the hub. The only thing that Lawrence had, they never were a town, all they had was a store that had the post office in the store. And I do have an original picture of the store, but my focus was not on that, on Lawrence tonight. But anyway, and also, let me set this down. And I thought I would share this with you. This is taking at Licking, and this is 1895 picture. And as you note, you can see there's been a forest fire. In 1895, a forest fire came up, believe it or not, all the way from the Columbia River, and it came up this way, and it went through this area, and it actually went up into Canada. They could not fight it because they couldn't. They didn't have airplanes or anything. But this is a neat picture. This is actually blowing up. If you really look at it, you can see Mom and Pop in here with the kids. They're all dressed up, probably in their finest, because not too often you got your picture taken. I don't know if this is a Kinsey photo. I don't know that, but anyway, this is 1895. And also, I wanted to see here. And I wanted to read a little article. Let me sit down. I wanted to read a little article that was dated May 2nd, 1891. I guess I better get this. 1891, and this is from the Fairhaven paper. And it says, leaving Deming Station. They were on an, this was, remember what I said in 1891? That was when the railroad came. Well, what they did is they ran a train with fancy cars with fancy dignitaries in it, and they came all the way, well, Deming, Lawrence, and then they came to Licking, and then they came to Everson and so forth, Nooksack, and then they ended up in Sumas. It says, leaving Deming Station about a mile down the track, we were greeted by the homesteaders in the area. One of these was Hugh McArway, that's a hard word, a cheerful Scotsman. It was in this area that we saw farms and more clearing of home sites, more smoke from the land clearing darkens the sun. Soon we came to a little village called Licking. There is a little log schoolhouse where Miss Penfield is teacher. Large stands of big cedars and firs almost shut the sun out of the school. 4 big mills have been built here. Chap and Company, and then there's Not Baker Shingle Company, J.H. Parker and Company, McGee and Company, and so on. And they also, Licking has a fine general store. So, but another thing that I wanted to share, this minute here, where have I got that? Okay. My notes here. The Licking Post Office was established in May 27th, 1887, and only went to 1894. I've never seen a letter or anything with a Licking postmark. I do have a number of Lawrence ones, and another thing that I wanted to say here about being we're at post office here, and I'll read this. And back in the old days, postmasters, they got compensation. It says, during the early years of Whatcom County, postmasters were compensated according to the annual receipts which their facility generated, or post office generated. More business generated, more receipts, and consequently greater compensation for the postmaster. As communities grew, local postal receipts also grew and the postmaster's annual compensation increased. Okay, here's some numbers, and this is over a year's time, how much extra money they get. Okay, 1885, $39.
A year.
And then the big money came in 1899, got $48, and then actually 1901 it went up to 73. And so they were encouraged to get more business and everything, and so being wages were hardly anything, that was extra money. And so they greatly encouraged to get the job done. And another thing that being we're touching on schools, what was that picture? Anyway, let's see. Okay, here we go. This is a picture of the first school in Licking. And this is, let's see, what's that dated? 1897. And I've never, I know about where it was, by the way, because I told you earlier, but anyway, that's what it looked like. And another thing, and you're thinking, well, maybe the Licking School was something to do with Lawrence. It actually didn't. And it had to do with, it was in Hopewell, it was called Hopewell Licking School District number 21. And I went to the archives a couple years ago up at Western, spent a lot of time there, and each year the schools, all the schools in the county, were required to keep a sheet of all the students that attended, their birth date, what grade they were in, so on and so forth. And the neat part was it had their name, and it also told who their parents was, and their parents had to sign it. And I think this is the neat part because you get to see the ones that had the first homesteads here, they got their signatures and everything. And what I have here is the first on Licking here is far as the students' names and everything is dated 1891, and it only goes to 1932 because the state told each school that they can't do this anymore. All the names, all their records have to be sent into the state of Washington, and it ended. And so what I have here, this is just Hopewell and Licking here. I have quite a bit more on the other schools, but anyway, so Licking, like I say, backtracking here a little bit, was just simply, didn't last too many years. It's simply a post office in a store, and that was it. And it was right beside the railroad tracks, and without the railroad, it wouldn't have existed, period. And that's, of course, without the railroads, most of them wouldn't have made it at all. But our next, should we say next month, we're going to be talking about the schools, Jim Berg and his wife, and I would like everyone to attend because that's going to be neat. And Jim has the same information I have, and I hope he brings a lot of it along as far as it's really interesting just to read a few of these census, because it's really neat. And if you want a real genealogy tree, this is it, because it has everything in it, and just on a few pages.
Nice.
So that's the neat part. So this is basically what I had on Licking. anyway, that's it.
Thank you, that's
Good,
interesting.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Have you ever found any printed documentation to document that place other than newspaper clippings?
I never have.
Like a ribbon or?
Sure like to.
Yeah.
Being it was gone by I think like 1904 or something. I've never seen a picture. Like I say, I've seen a picture of a envelope with a postmark on it. I would love to have one, but pretty. They're not rare, but they're scarce.
Licking stamps.
Yeah. And
And it's spelled exactly like licking, L-I-C-K?
Licking.
Licking
Yeah.
stamps.
And it's because that gentleman liked his Licking County, Ohio, and then he named, actually not here, but he named another town that too. And he, by the way, he died in 1893. This J.V. Smith, so his licking was too much for him.
You took a licking.
I wish I knew more because it intrigues me, but I don't, and I don't think anyone else does either. It's just, I think on different topics we it's our passion. I have a lot of stuff on Lawrence. I know a lot about that, which is a whole different deal. But like I say, earlier I was telling Jim that the Highway 9 Lawrence was paved in 1919, and when you think of the amount of money, $213,000, they did it in sections. They did it, first of all, by the way, we're talking about roads here. They did it from Deming to Lawrence, and then from Lawrence to Everson, and then from Everson to Sumas. And that's how they did it.
Work their way north.
Worked their way north, and of course now a lot of, it's blacktop now. But, of course I remember.
How long have you been researching to create that detailed map of all those?
I did that map there in about 4 months. I think I've told you I just finished one on this area here.
Right.
I don't have the roads, I have them all in, but I don't have, there's a lot of roads here. But I don't have them labeled yet. But I just, that, and how I did this, by the way, a township map is, I got a box of information was a big box like this, in a box, the homesteads and so on and so forth, and then I put it together and then did this. But it's like anything, it's a lot of work. But I think when you enjoy what you do, who cares about work? You just enjoy what you do.
You've created something that will benefit those of us.
Well, I think too that, I tattered the edge, I got more of it. Just like this, you see, I did not realize that it was so big. But if you want to, by the way, while we're on a map subject here, if you want to know how big this area is, the border is the Haverstick Road. It's not the boundary. The Haverstick Road is the border of the township here. The trap line to the west, and of course the Massey Road to the south. That's where this cuts off too. And when you go to the east, it's the top of the mountain.
Really?
It's the top of the mountain.
That's funny.
And what surprised me is most of this if you figure the quarter of it here, this is all hills and mountains. And but they did it for the timber, and actually when they did have a homestead up there, a lot of times they had a small mill so they could build their own log houses. So yeah. So anyway, is there any other questions? We're about out of time here.
Well, that makes sense. I was just thinking, because I live on South Pass Road, but I'm the first address that's part of Sumas. My house was Sumas. The house east of us, west of us, is Everson address. And I've always wondered, like, where was that? So the top of the mountain. You know?
It's the top of the mountain. Yeah, I wasn't going to bring the Nooksack one because that wasn't, the Nooksack Everson one. That took me less time to do that one because I got my feet wet on this one.
So how many have you done?
Well, I've only done 2 so far, but I would like to do Deming on to the east, and I would like to continue on from the trap line and go this way to the Linden Township. But it takes a bit. But I think the neat part in anything you do history-wise is you learn so much along the way, big or small. That's the neat part. A lot of times we learn not to do it again. But anyway, so.
Thank you, Mom.
Okay.
Thank you. So for our Nooksack Valley Heritage Center, right, I've been doing these tapes, digitizing the tapes, and I was listening to the Mavis tape, and she said her family came here with the immigrant trains. And I'm going, well, I just don't remember ever learning about those trains, and if I did, I don't remember. So I Googled it, and they were, in fact, they were called the immigrant trains. Well, I didn't know, if this was maybe just her family. So I Googled it, because I needed to know right then and there what this immigrant train was. And apparently, the railroads went to Europe and advertised the West Coast and how you could have that American dream, and it helped foster their land and the value of their property. So they would go to Europe, and they would try to give these tickets or sell the tickets, as well as on the East Coast. They would give the tickets. It was Burlington Northern was one of the most ambitious from the little bit of research I did, and it started. Though there was they said millions of acres for farming, timber, and mining, which kind of piqued people's interest, and they could follow the dream. And Robert Louis Stevenson was so curious about this that he took the immigrant train. So you can read, firsthand in his book, Across the Plains. It was published in 1895. And it says the middle volume of his writings, of the American Travels Trilogy. I'm not familiar with that work, but the middle volume is called The Amateur Immigrant. So he took these trains, and they weren't your typical, it sounded like if you bought a ticket in New York and you wanted to go to Seattle, you would get a train car that probably had a sleeping bunk, had
I don't know if
a
you
nice
wanna
chair, had
do
some
anything with this
food
map, or what do
accommodations,
you-
but these weren't that way. They were a long train, and they had just benches.
I was gonna say bench seats.
And on one end would be the wood stove, and on the other side was a toilet.
Oh, wow.
And they would come across, and the only accommodations for food was when they made a stop at one of the railway stations. But oftentimes, if you weren't really listening well, they left, and there you'd be stranded. But it was just really very interesting
Wow, that
to
is
me.
really interesting. And the Mavis family, and so they came here
Yeah.
through that.
It says, well, here's a little excerpt of it. It was about 2 p.m. on Friday that I found myself in front of the immigrant house with more than 100 others to be sorted and we can use the word, and boxed for the journey. A white-haired official with a stick under one arm and a list in the other hand stood apart in front of us and called name after name in the tone of a command. At each name you would see a family gather up its brats and bundles and run for the hindmost of the 3 cars that stood awaiting us, and I soon concluded that this was to get set apart for the women and children. The second or central car, it turned out, was devoted to men traveling alone, and the third to the Chinese.
Yeah, that was exciting.
Yeah, and then there's a little bit, the benches are too short for anything but a young child. Where there is scarce elbow room for 2 to sit, there will not be a space enough for 1 to lie. The railroad company's servants have conceived a plan for the better accommodation of travelers. They prevail on every 2 to chum together. So, and while food was available when the train would stop, there could be very long stretches between the stops. Many families ran short on food. To add to the immigrants' fears, when the train pulled out of a station, the conductors frequently did not yell, "All aboard." So these third-class passengers had to pay close attention to their train or be left behind. I used the main stations were L.A., San Francisco, and Seattle. And there were, this was very popular. I mean, a lot of folks came out.
So that's probably in the background of Platted.
So this was in like around 1870.
Yeah, I'd like
After
to,
the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. So thereafter.
so there's probably nobody alive that ever done one of those.
And I was,
Wow.
when I get some time, I'm going to research more
Yeah,
about it,
that
because I
makes
just
me
thought,
interested,
wow,
too.
that's really curious. But that's how the Mateys came from. They were in the Midwest, though, I believe. I have to re-listen to it. And then they took the immigrant train to Seattle, and then, which I never thought about, how would you get to Seattle
Yeah.
up here? Well, of course, by boat, right? There weren't roads for them to come up. I don't think. Maybe you know of one,
So
Marv.
they
But
went from
they would take a
Seattle
ship
to
then
Bellingham.
from Seattle to Bellingham.
Wow, that's really interesting.
So,
Thank you, Kristen.
oh, you're welcome.
That was a bonus.
Yeah, it was. It was a cool one.
How I did this map is, I'm from the old school days. This is all hand done. Each one of these homesteads with the person's name and patent date when it was patented, and also in there is how many acres. Each little piece of paper in here is hand done, hand glued on this map. And the different color-coded roads that you see, I was an auto body all my life, and I had a lot of leftover stripe tape. So that's what I did for the roads. I thought, everybody has a black road, let's have a red road, let's have a blue road, and let's have a green road. Because what happens is it makes the map more colorful, and it also makes it more readable and more understandable. And that's how I did that. But this is all done by hand.
It's incredible. It's so exact,
So
and
precise,
perfect
yeah.
how you did
And
that.
my one I just got done with, which is this area here, Everson, Nooksack, and Sumas, is done the same way. It's slightly bigger, but that was harder to do because it took me shorter time, but it had probably 3 or 4 times more roads. And I had fun. I'm going to do it again.
So you have one that covers Nooksack City too?
All I have is, well, any of the homesteads, it's just like this. And so, and what I've put in, like the other map, I put in like, for instance, of course, where Everson is, Nooksack, and then I'll put in where Van Buren is, Clearbrook, Sumas, things like that. So what you do is you want a point to where you can tell where everything is. And by the way, the earliest homestead in Township 39 is 1887. And on the Nooksack one, it's I think it's 1875.
So I'm kinda like you, I'd like to see the Nooksack one, cause I'd like to know who homesteaded where I am, you know?
Yeah, it's all done, I didn't bring it, but,
Yeah, I'd like to see that one too.
yeah.
Is there a favorite section on that map that you like?
Well, I think the favorite section on this map is the place where I grew up is, oh, I gotta find it now. I know the number by heart. But anyway, it's right there, just right above Lawrence. In fact, the land actually touched the tracks. It was originally, not all homesteads were 160 acres. Ours was, the least homestead I found on the Nooksack Everson map was 20.20 acres. And a lot of land that they homestead, you see, is in the middle. The river goes around it. Well, that's not land anymore. It's all completely changed. And so the first settlers, of course, that came got the best land, and you got what's left over.
Right.
And let's see, I'm trying to think. But basically 160 acres, I think, on the home place that I grew up on. I think the cost was $16 for 160 acres.
Oh,
That's what
my
it cost.
goodness.
And how it went on is actually it cost more for, let's say you got a 50-acre parcel, you paid more for that. But 160, they gave you a better deal because they wanted the land to be settled, and they wanted it to be homesteaded, and they wanted it to be cultivated, crops put in and farmed.
Wow.
I did this for, I think, for myself to start out with, but I'm the sort of person that I just love sharing information. If I can have more copies made of this. If someone would like to have one, I will not charge them a thing. It's just the idea of spreading history out there. And I just, like I say, I love sharing on anything that I have. It's not private.
Thank you, that was great.